And today on Capitol Hill, the chief of the NSA, General Keith Alexander, is fielding questions from lawmakers on the Senate Judiciary Committee. The focus of the hearing is continued oversight of U.S. government surveillance authorities. And it's hearings just like this one that have been a common staple on Capitol Hill since June, since Edward Snowden began spilling the NSA's secrets out in newspapers around the world. The latest secret, published today in the Washington Post, reveals how the NSA is using the same techniques that corporate online advertisers use to pinpoint surveillance targets and to gather intelligence on people's locations. Essentially, the NSA is using Google cookies. Now, cookies are little packets of data that allow online advertisers to uniquely track you and me and what websites we visit in order to tailor online advertising for us. Cookies are the reason why websites you go to seem to remember you, and why if you search for something on Google one day, you'll be hit with ads for that very same thing the next day. Basically, cookies allow for corporate advertisers to spy on your online activity, and they've been doing it for years. And now, we know that this online infrastructure, these cookies set up by companies like Google to allow advertisers to track our online activity, is also being used by the NSA to single out one person's communications data as it flows amongst everything else on the internet. Not only that, the NSA is using the location data that's embedded in apps on people's smartphones to get a more precise location of where people are. Here too, for online advertising reasons, apps will send unique data about you, like your location, to corporate advertisers, a lot of the time without you even knowing about it. And the NSA is taking advantage of that information too. Now, it's not completely clear how the NSA is gathering this data, whether companies are voluntarily sharing it with the, or whether the NSA is just taking it, or whether companies like Google are being legally compelled to hand it over through a FISA order. You might remember earlier this week, tech giants like Google and Apple banded together to push for reforms to the NSA and its surveillance operations, which are beginning to erode trust in consumers and could hurt the bottom line of these same companies. Also teaming up against the NSA, some of the world's leading authors. 500 authors from 81 different countries around the world, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, are joining together to call on the United Nations to pass new international protections from spying. In their statement, the authors say, "This fundamental human right has been rendered null and void through abuse of technological developments by states and corporations for mass surveillance purposes. A person under surveillance is no longer free. A society under surveillance is no longer a democracy." And of course, what's a week of new NSA revelations without an international relations mess? This one coming from CBC News in Canada, where a new Snowden document exposes Canadian spies doing work on behalf of the NSA to spy on approximately 20 trading partners, classified as high-priority countries. The NSA appears to be using Canada to exploit relationships that the United States can no longer keep. Unclear what sort of diplomatic fallout the Canadians may experience as a result of this latest leak. So that's the latest of everything coming out with the NSA, just as the chief of the NSA faces off with senators today for an oversight hearing. Now, for more on this, I'm joined by Shahed Buttar, Executive Director at the Bill of Rights Defense Committee here in D.C. Shahed, welcome to the show again.
Thanks for having me on, Sam.
So this latest revelation about the NSA piggybacking on Google cookies to pinpoint certain targets and then using app location data to get a more precise location of certain people they're looking for. Commercial advertising, this is what this comes down to, is this sort of commercial spying has been kind of flying under the outrage radar for a few years now.
Right.
Now that this story comes out, will this bring more attention to what corporations have been, this sort of spying corporations have been doing on us for years?
It very well might. And there's a great documentary out that's just making the rounds now called Terms and Conditions May Apply, about this sort of data exchange from the private sector and companies that are selling us goods to the government and the intelligence agencies that are monitoring and watching us, including our First Amendment protected behavior. The difference between those two spheres historically has been that Google, for instance, can't show up at your house with a gun and put you in handcuffs and detain you. That's a power that uniquely the government has. Precisely the problem with the co-optation of the online advertising companies' cookies is that it collapses the distinction between those two things, so that anything you do share with an online company, whether through the PRISM program or whether through the data center hacks or whether through these kinds of tools, the NSA gets it too. And it's historically because the companies don't have the monopoly on the use of legitimate force that the state has. I think that's been one of the reasons people have been more comfortable with allowing online advertisers to track online activity. It is a very different equation now that we know that our government spying agencies are watching that information too.
Yeah, and I mean, let's face it, the NSA has tools that go well beyond the scope of tech companies. And if we were to limit these tech companies, that doesn't mean that the NSA wouldn't be able to spy on us. But at the same time, we've allowed Google and these companies to build this sort of online infrastructure to create these cookies, and a lot of the time they let these cookies go because they're very lucrative. And
right.
by embedding these cookies and tracking users, they can offer free services or advertisers are paying them for that data. But can we expect, moving forward, civil libertarians like Rand Paul or Justin Amash, who've really been leading the forefront against government spying and the NSA, to kind of change their tune and reorient themselves toward corporate spying as well?
You know, in a lot of those cases, some of the same officials, the elected officials who you're talking about, tend to be free market adherents. And so they might, for instance, find themselves comforted by the idea that the market will select out advertisers who are very abusive toward their users' privacy. I don't think that's necessarily a good argument in this case, because we've seen, for instance, that there are incentives, and the markets don't always work very well, there are incentives for online advertisers to abuse privacy. Will those particular members of Congress see the concern enough to take an iconoclastic position with respect to their own free market adherence? That's an open question. I really don't know the answer there, but I will say that as long as the NSA is hacking the online internet companies, and the cookies aren't the only example of online infrastructure that the NSA has tapped. You know, the data centers coming out of New York have been tapped in the back end. The PRISM program basically hacks the back end of the internet companies' data
streams. We heard about the data link centers with Google and Yahoo.
This is why Brazil is trying to build their own to Europe to get around the U.S. servers.
And I want to get on that issue here in just a second, but I mentioned in the beginning here that General Keith Alexander's on the Hill testifying here. We have these hearings now every other week in which we bring the top spy chiefs on, they answer questions, and yet we haven't seen any legislation come out of this. Right. There were a few lawmakers who were positioning themselves to do something with the NDAA and try and, in the Senate, try and rein in the NSA through that. We learned this week that that's not going to happen because there's not going to be any NDAA amendments in the Senate. What's the purpose of these hearings? What do you think lawmakers are trying to do with these hearings every other week or so? If it's not to create legislation, is it to give the NSA a platform to defend itself against these leaks each week?
A couple different possibilities. You know, one of them is that they're grandstanding to mollify their constituents and pretend like they're doing something productive. An alternative possibility is that they themselves, the members of Congress, are sincerely interested in the information that's been kept from them for the last 10 years. Multiple members of the House Judiciary Committee complained earlier today that they didn't know about the extent of the surveillance programs, despite the Obama administration's repeated assurances that it has briefed Congress. A particular congresswoman from California, Zoe Lofgren, said that the briefing that the White House has cited on numerous occasions supporting this idea that Congress has been read into the programs is less than a page long and 8 sentences long, which is to say they themselves are being kept in the dark. And so maybe the hearings are serving this sort of oversight transparency function. Ultimately, though, you're right, Congress's job is to legislate and to oversee executive agencies. It's already failed on the oversight piece, and so legislation is long overdue. Some of the people proposing bills to restrain NSA spying include the very authors of the Patriot Act. James Sensenbrenner, a Republican from Wisconsin, and Patrick Leahy, a senator from Vermont, on the other side of the chamber, and they've teamed up to propose very, very significant restrictions on NSA spying. I do hope that the USA Freedom Act passes. Given the dysfunction visible across Congress, that's really anyone's guess.
Do you think the tech companies joining in the mix earlier this week changes the calculation on Capitol Hill and makes this legislation more likely, the USA Freedom Act?
I certainly hope so. I mean, and the tech companies have been, there are other issues, though, where the tech companies have been very allied on privacy concerns and yet not been able to secure congressional reforms, even around more meager proposals. The Electronic Communications Privacy Act, for instance, has been an object of attention of the tech companies for over a year now. This is a bill that hasn't been, or a law now, that hasn't been updated in 30 years, giving not the NSA, but local police and the FBI and every other law enforcement agency the right to access stored communications like your Gmail account without a warrant. And that doesn't even reach these issues around NSA spying that historically people have thought were going to be a tougher sell, a longer ranging issue.
It's making other things possible that weren't possible. I want to bring in Steve Anderson. He's the executive director at Open Media in Vancouver. He probably has a unique perspective on this new leak about how Canadian spies were basically working at the behest of the NSA to spy on key trading partners. Steve, what has been the reaction in Canada to a lot of these revelations since June, and how does this latest leak maybe change that reaction? Can we expect some fallout out of this leak with Canada's allies?
I think for sure, and I think Canadians domestically have been increasingly alarmed. Tens of thousands of people have reached out to lawmakers to call for more oversight. And really what it comes down to is trust. I mean, and this latest revelation that our Canadian spy agency is, and our kind of embassies are being used at the behest of the U.S. NSA for spying on our allies is just making that worse. And I mean, our government won't answer basic questions like how many Canadians are swept up in this surveillance, what information do they have on us, how secure are those databases, is that information being shared with other countries like the U.S., the NSA, and other countries beyond that. So basically what is happening, and so far our government has been really tight-lipped. They won't tell us what's happening here, and the fact that we hear now that some of this spying is going on basically the NSA is telling our country what to do and who to spy on just makes the concerns grow even stronger.
Steve, we've got the 500 authors who are calling on the UN to pass this new international charter to protect civil liberties in the digital age. What do you think something like that looks like, and how does that jive with what we're seeing on a country-by-country level, like Brazil trying to wall off its internet? What are the two avenues here? Which one should we take? Which one would work? Which one doesn't work?
Yeah, well, I think that we definitely need domestic legislation and really most countries around the world to rein in this surveillance. I think that it's out of step with basic understanding and expectations for the right to privacy. So you need that in Canada. You need that legislation in the U.S. Brazil needs to take action. Other countries need to take action. But I also believe that we need the privacy to be enshrined as a human right at the UN. There's a civil society coalition called Necessary and Proportionate that's pushing for that. We've joined in that at Open Media and with groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and others. So I think that the writers coming out, speaking out about this is a kind of welcome step. Welcome development, and I think you're probably going to see more gamers actually out speaking out about this stuff now that it's been revealed that gamers are being spied on. And what's happening is more and more people are realizing how this affects them in their personal lives, and then they're becoming more vocal and engaged in the issue. And I think that's going to continue, and I hope that the politicians realize which way the wind is blowing, because it's going to continue going that way.
Shahid, there were some concerns when Brazil said that they wanted to kind of wall off their internet, and that if other countries start doing this, suddenly you've kind of destroyed the World Wide Web. Do you share those concerns, and is this idea of creating some international framework that kind of dictates all countries a better way to go about this?
I think most of the deepest concerns with countries defecting from the shared infrastructure of the internet are by Silicon Valley, because it's American firms and businesses that would stand to lose significant markets. As a constitutional lawyer, I tend to favor more robust checks and balances, and so if the infrastructure of the World Wide Web was dismantled so that no NSA could seize all the data traveling along the back end, I think that's a positive development because there are more checks and balances. There is an efficiency trade-off there, and I think that's the inevitable consequence of witnessing governments like our own abusing the trust of the commons to take advantage of the space that the open internet enabled to then co-opt freedom and freedom of thought. And one element of the author's statement that I think is really useful just to draw out is their well-established, not particularly controversial statement that people who are being surveilled are not free, and a society under surveillance cannot be a democracy. That is something that we understood in this country for a long time, and it changes the context for what's happening on the Hill. These aren't just hearings into the NSA spying programs, these are hearings into the assault on democracy in America.
Right, and I think Canada's going to be struggling with this problem too for a while here, Steve. And the issue that was brought up today at the hearing was about metadata, and we heard General Keith Alexander again defend metadata as not being such a big deal. Up there in Canada, metadata is still a really big deal, just like it is here, isn't that right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we joined with the BC Civil Liberties Association recently in launching their lawsuit against the government, which is basically saying that collecting our metadata, and that's our sensitive private information, to be clear, that's what it is, that collecting that information on law-abiding Canadians is unconstitutional. So absolutely people are concerned up here, and the government's going to need to answer on that. And listen, you know, metadata tells you, can tell authorities where you are, where you're going, who you're friends with, all kinds of sensitive information about your relationships. So I think it's absolutely crucial that there be checks and balances on that kind of information collection and storage.
Definitely. That was Shahed Buttar, Executive Director at the Bill of Rights Defense Committee here in D.C., and Steve Anderson, Executive Director at the Open Media in Vancouver. Thank you all.